Wonderful. So I think we can get started.
What can he see?
He can see us.
I can see a photo of Talia.
And now he can see us. Perfect.
Okay. Hi, Lisbeth.
Hi.
Wonderful.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
You have a very impressive accent.
You mean the image, not where I come from? Both. Okay, thank you.
This is the nature of Zoom, is you get to see the full interaction. All right. Karsten, it would be wonderful if you could start. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, an event hosted by the Kimball Smith Series on Science, Ethics, and International Affairs. My name is Karsten Heeger. I'm the chair of the Physics Department and the director of Wright Lab, and it's a great pleasure to be able to co-sponsor this event. I also wanted to note that this morning's event on nuclear weapons is also co-sponsored by the Political Science Department and the Jackson Institute for International Security Studies program. And it's really interesting for me as a Physics Department chair to be able to support programs and events that realize these connections between different institutes and programs on campus. And I'm particularly grateful to the for the co-organizers to put this together. The Kimball Smith Series is led by Talia Weiss and Ellie Singers, and the program content advisor is Lucas Arthur. And they have put together a wonderful discussion for today, and they've organized a number of events that really have enriched our seminar series in the physics department and across campus. Today's panel will be moderated by Talia Weiss. She's a physics PhD student, actually in my group in the physics department. She previously earned a master's in political science from the University of Chicago. And today she will moderate a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Talia.
Thank you so much, Professor Heeger, and welcome everyone to this program on nuclear weapons today. Physics and politics. So we'll start with a panel discussion followed by audience Q&A, and then the last 25 minutes or so will be reserved for you to have some small group discussions about questions that we'll pose on the screen. So thank you so much for joining us. One thing before we begin, I see pretty much everyone has done this, but I appreciate you having your name cards up and folded. That's great, so that when you begin the discussion, you'll be able to see who others are at your table. So that's wonderful. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. We have some really great panelists joining us to start off the conversation among all of you and to share their insights. Lisbeth Gronlund is a research affiliate at MIT's Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy. She received her PhD in theoretical physics from Cornell University and went on to co-direct the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Dr. Gronlund's work draws on her scientific background to analyze U.S. nuclear weapons and missile defense programs, and also to make policy recommendations. So thank you so much for joining us. Mm-hmm. We also have here Professor Alexandre Debs, who is a professor of political science at Yale, and whose research focuses on nuclear proliferation, the causes of war, and democratization. Professor Debs co-authored a book published in 2017 on the strategic causes of proliferation, and he teaches an undergraduate course here at Yale on nuclear politics. Professor Debs received a PhD in economics from MIT and an MPhil in economic and social history from Oxford. So thank you very much, Professor Debs.
My pleasure.
So to set the stage for this conversation, I think it's important to recognize that for many in the U.S. and elsewhere, the war in Ukraine really brought the issue of nuclear weapons to the fore, even though it has simmered under the surface here for decades. So at this time, it's especially important to understand the nuclear weapons landscape, both the status of technologies and also the political challenges and perhaps opportunities. So Dr. Gronlund, I wanted to start out by asking you, before we get into details about the war in Ukraine, how do nuclear weapons actually work? And what should we know about their level of destructive power?
Right. So there are two kinds of nuclear weapons. bombs. The kind that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they used uranium. And then the kind that is, with few exceptions, are the kind that exist in the world today, which are so-called two-stage, where there is a uranium piece, and then it incites a plutonium piece, and they can be much more powerful. Now, uranium and plutonium are required to build a nuclear weapon. You could do it with one or the other. As I said, the ones we have use both. Uranium is an ore in the ground, but it is not, you cannot use it in that form. You have to dig the uranium. The part you care about, which is an isotope, is less than 1%. So you have to get that 1%. And that is an ordeal. That you have a facility that does this. It's not something you can do in your backyard. The other element, plutonium, doesn't exist in nature at all. It is produced in reactors. So it's, there really is a linkage between nuclear power and nuclear materials. Now, for a reactor to produce plutonium, you would run it for only a few weeks. It's not the same one that you would use, and you could, for nuclear power. So any nuclear weapon is surrounded by high explosives. And it's those explosives that, by compressing very symmetrically, will basically cause this fission, which is uranium, to explode. And it will, among other things, will eject X-rays, and that is what gets the plutonium to explode. Okay. And there are, in the world, there are weapons that go all the way down from less than 1 kiloton. Kiloton is the measure that they use in my world. And it is in reference to 1 kiloton is the explosive power that 1,000 kilograms of TNT would produce. I want to say a little bit about who has them. So the United States has, and so there's also, you might have them deployed, you might have them capable of being used but stored. You might have taken the warhead out because you're going to dismantle it. At one point during history, the US and Russia has something like 70,000 warheads. It has come down. Each country has about 1,500 plus deployed weapons and bombs. Oh, that's not gonna vary. So generally, there are 3 ways that countries use to get these weapons from the US to the target. Probably the most famous are the land-based missiles that come out of silos. You've probably seen photos of that or images. They travel from the US to Russia. They're very long-ranged. Probably less well-known is we have the same kinds of missiles on submarines. The big difference is that everybody knows where the silos are, and in theory, nobody knows where the subs are once they're out at sea. The third category are long-range bombers, and they release bombs. The vast majority of the weapons are held by the US and Russia. Other countries have smaller numbers. So France and Britain and China are allowed to have nuclear weapons, so-called, because there is a treaty signed, and everybody signed up to say, I will not have nuclear weapons. And there were 5 countries that were allowed, they're grandfathered in a way, and those are those 5 countries. let me say a few words about missile defense, which comes in two flavors, and that is for physics reasons. So the first flavor is when you have to intercept the warhead or what have you outside the atmosphere, and those, not surprisingly, are called exo-atmospheric. So a warhead, a missile that is going to hit Russia, it's a powerful missile. The stages drop off at the very top. You have a piece that is able to move a little bit and aim it. Once it's aimed, it just follows on a trajectory, a ballistic trajectory. Everybody knows where it is if you know where it was. At this point, it is going through, it's outside the atmosphere, there's no air, hence there's no air resistance, which means that a heavy warhead is going to travel exactly the same trajectory as a lightweight balloon or anything. Okay, so if you're looking at it, you have your sensors and they're all going like this until you hit the atmosphere, which has air resistance, and then the heavier object will go faster. So all the talk from the beginning of Star Wars and Reagan till now have been about the exo-atmospheric missile defense, which is, I said, very, very vulnerable to countermeasures, to having lots of things released, and it's, I want to say, practically impossible. Initially, and it requires that the interceptor smash into the warhead. It's destroyed simply by, they're going very fast, simply by contact. Early on, when you couldn't do that, the U.S. had missile defenses with nuclear weapons on them. And these were deployed in Illinois, and people didn't like it, and so they are gone. And so the other kind of missile defense, as I told you, is within the atmosphere, endo-atmospheric, and Patriot, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. They are defending against much shorter range missiles. And because they're in the atmosphere, the missile might be jiggling as it bumped around. And so it requires, being able to aim at it. And in principle, that is something that you could do better at than they have so far. So those are the two types. I want to say one more thing about nuclear weapons. I said that there were the warheads, or basically like the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were what people call them just nuclear weapons. And then the ones that pretty much everybody has, which are H-bombs, hydrogen weapons, two-stage. The other distinction is the range of the missile or aircraft that is going to be used. And there's the terminology for the long ones is strategic. Terminology for the short ones is theater. And the point with these is to engage in a way, in conventional war. And the US and Russia both have them. But they are not covered under any treaty. So there's a lot of those, but they're not covered. I think that's it.
That's a great setup, both in terms of the technology, not just the warheads, but the delivery vehicles and defense. It's really helpful, and also getting a little bit into the treaties, which are important to understand. And so to build off of that, Professor Debs, Dr. Gronlund told us about some of the countries who have nuclear weapons. I wanted to know if you could tell us more about when those countries acquired their weapons, to give us that historical perspective, and also add in a discussion of that for countries who got their weapons after the NPT.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Talia and Luca and Ellie for organizing. It's nice to reconnect with Ellie, who took my undergrad nuclear politics lecture a couple of years ago. So I understand you have a diverse audience of undergraduate and graduate students in the room. And before I answer the specific question, I just want to say how fascinating nuclear politics is. And I guess it's nice to think about it in theoretical and abstract terms, and it's a little harder to do it now that reality is coming back to us. And I may be preaching to the choir here by telling you this is really fascinating, but let me explain a couple of ways in which, no matter what your background and scholarly interests are, you may come to it, to this problem, and have a rich experience studying it. If you're a historian of US foreign policy, nuclear weapons lurk in the background since 1945. So we can think of flashpoints and crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where nuclear weapons are front and center. But we may also think about some of the infrastructure that have been set up during the Cold War that are still with us now, like NATO, a nuclear alliance that the US and partners set up to contain the Soviet Union, and now is still with us and is an important dimension of the current war, which I'll talk about later in the conversation. If you're a physicist interested in science and politics, nuclear security is a very important task of the US government. It's a very important task of the Department of Energy. And scientists have had an impact on foreign policy since the beginning. Einstein wrote a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt telling him, the Nazis may be after a nuclear weapon. We need to conduct efforts similarly to develop this technology. So starting from him, coming to, for example, Ernie Moniz, an MIT physics professor who served in the Obama administration and negotiated the Iran deal. So if you're a physicist interested in science and politics, the nuclear dimension is one in which there are many ways to be involved, and there's a history of scientists being involved. And if you're an econ major like I was, interested in game theory, a lot of the theoretical innovations that that the field has produced have been inspired by containing the Soviet Union and thinking of nuclear crises. The work of Thomas Schelling is really prominent there. So I would say no matter what perspective you come to the question from, there's a lot to study. But there's also a lot that's really confusing, complicated, and contradictory. I would say nuclear politics is full of contradictions. Whether you look at the causes of proliferation, which states have nuclear weapons and why, or whether you look at the effect of proliferation, what states do once they have nuclear weapons. So I'll talk about the causes and who has it in a second, but first thinking about the effect, those are terrifying weapons, but many international scholars would tell you those are weapons of peace. The fact that we have nuclear weapons has been an important factor in the Cold War remaining cold, and the two superpowers agreeing at some point that they should de-escalate tension and they should go on a path of negotiating ways to control these weapons. They are weapons that have revolutionized international relations, but they haven't been used on the battlefield for more than 75 years. So how could they have such a large impact if they haven't been used on the battlefield? But the idea here is that they do in anticipation of those terrible consequences, and that before nuclear age, in order to threaten your enemy with unacceptable disaster and numbers of casualties, you would first need to prevail against them, so defeat the enemy army, before you can threaten their cities, for example. Well, in the nuclear age, if you have a nuclear weapon and the capability to deliver it, it could be one, it could be a few more, but as long as you have the capability of detonating nuclear weapons on enemy territory, it doesn't matter if you would win the war. If you can threaten to detonate those weapons, you can threaten unacceptable damage, and that may be enough to deter the enemy. And what that means is that, yes, these are terrifying weapons, but in a way, they're the weapons of the weak. It's the weak states that would otherwise be vulnerable to much stronger states that have a lot to gain in acquiring these weapons. And that gets to the question of the causes of proliferation and the contradictions there, which is that, yes, nuclear weapons are the weapons of the weak, but very few weak states have them. So why is that? If we just look at why states want nuclear weapons, the weak states would really want to have them. And the answer is that it's really risky for these weak states to try to acquire nuclear weapons. It takes time, effort, resources to develop the technology and the delivery capabilities. And in that interim, enemies, allies can intervene, and the weak states will be especially vulnerable. And so we've seen Syria having a reactor destroyed in 2007 by Israel. We saw Iraq being the target of strikes in the 1990s, and it was one of the factors in the invasion in 2003. There's an argument that the Iran deal that is now being renegotiated was coerced onto Iran as a result of sanctions and the threat of military actions. It had to accept this deal under the threat of intervention by the US and Israel. And the nuclear dimension in this is an element in the Ukraine war as well. Not so much Ukraine developing nuclear weapons on its own, but perhaps joining NATO, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the final contradiction I want to say is, if you're distraught, despaired, I would say you could look back at history and think that it's darkest before the dawn. Professor Gronlund talked about the hydrogen bomb. Well, the hydrogen bomb is an order of magnitude more powerful than the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that really woke up the international community that something should be done about controlling the technology. If you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was a moment of heightened tension. I think it did lead to an improvement in relations, and it led the ground for détente between the two superpowers. They agreed to ban partially the testing of nuclear weapons in '63. They agreed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty in '68. And so when we have high tension, it may wake up leaders and activists in the international community for action. So let's think about those contradictions as we think about all those questions. That would be the theoretical framework I would use. So in terms of who has weapons, well, first, the P5 countries were the first to acquire them. The US in '45, the Soviet Union in '49, the UK in '52, France in 1960, and China in 1964. Now, once you go beyond those states, 5 more acquired them, 1 gave it up. But as the international infrastructure of the Non-Proliferation Treaty comes online and says there are 2 states, those with nuclear weapons and those without them, it's those with nuclear weapons at the moment in which that treaty is negotiated. And so we have less information about the precise moment at which these other states acquire nuclear weapons. So Israel is believed to develop it in '67. India tests in '74. It is a wake-up call. The NPT is agreed to in '68 and comes online in 1970. And the Indian test, I mean, interestingly, they detonate a nuclear weapon and they call it a peaceful nuclear explosion. They say this is not meant to be for weaponizing the technology, and it does take some time to develop military delivery capabilities. South Africa is believed to acquire it around 1979, but gave it up in 1993, and we can talk about the circumstances. If you think that would be a model, we can discuss that. Pakistan is thought to develop it around 89, sometime in the 80s, although they don't test until 1998. And North Korea performed its first test in 2006, though it's not a very successful test, and they've continued to test since, and some think they actually had the capability sooner. But it is, so the countries that have it, 9 countries, the US, Russia, UK, France, China, and Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. And as Professor Gronlund said, this is what you would describe as horizontal proliferation, who has nuclear weapons, but in terms of vertical proliferation, how many nuclear weapons each of these countries has, it's really concentrated within the US and Russia. More than 90% of the overall stockpile are controlled by these 2 countries.
Thank you so much for that information. And I want to pick up on what you said about how in moments of heightened tension, there is potentially an opportunity to stimulate change. We certainly seem to be in a moment of heightened tension regarding nuclear weapons today. And as some background, when Vladimir Putin announced the invasion of Ukraine 2 months ago, he made what I would say is a veiled nuclear threat, saying that if anyone tried to interfere, quote, "the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history." And a few days later, Putin said that Russia's nuclear forces would assume a, quote, "special mode of combat duty." So turning now to this current war and crisis, I wanted to ask Professor Debs, against that backdrop, do you think that nuclear weapons played a role in creating or enabling this conflict? And how, if at all, do you think nuclear weapons have affected how the conflict has unfolded to date?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think they have played a role. And when we think about the cause of the conflict, I guess you could choose to look at it in two ways. One would be the cultural perspective, the false claims that Putin has made about Ukrainian atrocities against Russian-speaking minorities. And you would say, we've seen this before. Hitler had similar language in 1938. He wanted to protect the German minorities of the Czechoslovakia. And now we know he had even grander ambitions. He, in fact, sort of regretted not having started World War II over that crisis. And we see through it now, and the Biden administration has been very clear in calling them out before the start of the war, and it didn't deter them, but now that we see how they are conducting the war and how they're treating Ukrainian civilians, we can say this was all a false narrative and these claims of denazification and rejecting the reality of Ukrainian nationhood. That would be one perspective. What I would say is, if you think of it from a strategic security standpoint, specifically the role of NATO and Russia's concerns over expansion of NATO, not only do I think it's a stronger explanation of the conflict, but actually in some way it leads to a more optimistic view about how the conflict may be resolved. So first of all, the concern over NATO was a factor in the 2014 war. I think it is a factor as well now, when we've seen before the start of the war, acceleration of US and NATO aid and exercises in the fall of 2021 between NATO and Ukraine. Putin has been consistent in complaining about NATO expansion to the east. Now, I guess one reaction would be, well, that's a morally wrong position of Russia or Putin to present. They're the obvious aggressor. This is a war of choice. But I would say put yourself in the shoes of the other side to understand why the conflict happens and what would be a way out. So why would Russia fear Ukraine being under the NATO umbrella? It's not as if Ukraine would just say, okay, now we have an umbrella, let's go and conquer Moscow. Well, no, but again, as I told you before, nukes are weapons of the weak. And if Ukraine were under a NATO umbrella, this would be a significant change in the Russian calculation of the security environment that they are facing, either in the context of an international conflict between Russia and NATO, or in considering potential domestic threats to the Putin regime. So what do I mean by international conflict? So yes, it could be that there's a future conflict in which Russia is the aggressor, but if it has Ukraine as a NATO country on its border, this is a very different calculation over the campaigns they would launch or the threats that they would face, even if they are the aggressors. And so, during the Cold War, Finland and Sweden remained neutral. Now they're talking about joining. Since the 19th century, the U.S. has said, the Western Hemisphere is my sphere of influence, and if other states come in and try to deploy military capabilities there, this is unacceptable to us. And that was a backdrop to the Cuban Missile Crisis, unacceptable for the Soviets to deploy offensive weapons in the Western Hemisphere. So we've seen that. We've seen great powers worry about weaker neighbors falling under the influence and the protection of great power rivals. And if we think of domestic conflicts, so if the threat is internal, it is a different calculation if Ukraine is a member of NATO and can provide a safe haven for opposition groups domestically. I think it reduces the set of things that Russia can do. I mean, the best scenario is for Russia to have a leader in Ukraine that's friendly to Russian interest. But the next best thing would be a neutral NATO that agrees not to be, a neutral Ukraine that agrees not to be part of NATO. And we've seen that in the past in For example, South Africa invading Angola, fearing that Angola could be a communist country, a safe haven for liberation movements within South Africa. So we may have our own moral views about whether that's something to be done or not, but there is a historical pattern. And there is a historical pattern of Russia worrying about neighboring states falling under NATO. I mean, the 2008 war against Georgia came within a few months of NATO saying at a Bucharest summit, Georgia and Ukraine will be part of NATO. And Putin then and the Russian leadership at the time said, this is unacceptable, this is a serious security threat. And he was able to invade Georgia and defeat them very quickly, and again, sort of claiming a peace mission to protect the minorities in the territory. So we can reject the narrative, but the security concerns were there. And the language, in fact, is quite similar. But also go back in time, we talked about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I guess we would think it's a treaty about non-nuclear weapons not getting nuclear weapons. Well, that's Article 2, and that's only part of Article 2. The other part of Article 2 is about the transfer of technology, and that's what Article 1 is, that the nuclear powers won't transfer technology to non-nuclear weapon states. So this is really a treaty that comes about because the Soviet Union told the Americans, we don't want West Germany to be close to nuclear weapons. We fought 2 world wars against them. We don't want to fight another one against them. So you need to make sure that they can't get their hands on nuclear weapons. So I think it's important to know that historical context, even if we don't agree with it. And I also think it's important to know what would be a ramp out, which is that if you look at it from an ethnic cultural perspective, then I think it's a fight to the finish. Either Russia wipes out, as many Ukrainian civilians as it can, or if it's a concern over the possibility of Ukraine being under the NATO umbrella, then maybe there is a future in which Ukraine agrees to remain neutral and not be part of NATO. And this is the Finlandization. Well, now Finland wants to be part of NATO, given what Russia did, but this was a previous solution. And we've seen the leadership in Kiev sort of being more explicit about its openness to it. So I wanted to mention these points about the causes of the conflict. But I've talked for long. Do you want me to say more about the nuclear dynamics, or should we move to Professor Gronlund? Or yeah.
Why don't I come back to you in a minute? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I wanted to actually pick up on one point you said where I wanted to bring in, I know Dr. Gronlund, you study U.S. nuclear policy, and Professor Debs, you were talking about Russia's concerns about Ukraine potentially coming under the NATO umbrella, which includes the possibility of, NATO nuclear weapons coming closer. So I wondered if you could talk, Dr. Gronlund, about what's the U.S.'s role in all this? I mean,
Yes.
We're talking about nuclear weapons in Europe.
Yeah.
What is our influence on it?
Right. So it's a bit of a misnomer that the NPT prohibits the nuclear weapon states from transferring weapons to other countries, including because U.S. nuclear weapons are in 5 countries, non-nuclear countries in Europe: Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey, although there is some question about whether they really are in Turkey after a few years ago, the coup attempt. And they have been there from the beginning of the Cold War. Then it was the opposite. NATO felt that it would not be able to fight the Soviet Union if it chose to invade Western Europe, and they decided the only thing they could do to defend themselves was to have nuclear weapons. Now these were all owned by the U.S. Okay, Germany did not build its own nuclear weapons, but the U.S. at one point there were 7,000 U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. You name it, nuclear howitzers, nuclear. I mean, it was insane, really. And they were there explicitly as a, anti-Soviet. Well, now things have turned around, of course. You know, Russia is the weak one. So it's sort of interesting to think about that. On the other hand, you know, the U.S. has not pulled these weapons out of Europe, and NATO explicitly says that we are a nuclear alliance, and we will have nuclear weapons until nobody else does. So there are about 100 at this point. It's gone down quite a bit. They're all bombs. They're on air bases. They're secure. There's an American officer there. They're in the floor under or next to an airplane, and the American officer would unlock it, and then it would be delivered by a German airplane with a German air pilot. And those aircraft have only a short range. Okay, they're not the long range. They are designed for conventional war in Europe. And I would say that the U.S. is kind of. I'm just going to read you something from a few years ago, which is public, but there's also a classified part. Okay, the United States will expand flexible U.S. nuclear options to include low-yield options, which is important for the preservation of credible deterrence against regional aggression, which is Russia. So it's not, they're holding on. They're holding on. So when Russia doesn't want NATO, near, it's because with NATO comes nuclear weapons. And it does complicate things. I mean, there are probably other reasons as well, but that was a big factor. And somehow, not transferring weapons to other states, the argument is, well, they're not, because there's a U.S. soldier protecting them. And the moment that they do transfer, namely, here you go, Germany, go for it, war will already have started and it's moot. There you go. So it's very complicated. The other thing I want to say, when Putin made this threat about, he's put his forces on high alert, not true. You can detect these things from satellites, and people in our community have access. In fact, there are satellites whose job it is to provide public access. They did not do anything. The subs are in port. If they were high alert, they'd be sent out. Everything was the same. And when I heard that, many people assumed that Russia was threatening to launch weapons against the U.S. I don't think so. I think it was threatening to use a small, short-range weapon in Europe against Ukraine.
That's a great piece of information, or set of information to understand, right, how the U.S. is involved when we're talking about NATO. I think some of what both of you have been saying starts to speak to the question, which is, I know, often discussed in political science and policy here, of whether nuclear weapons deter major conventional war.
Right.
And I think, we saw, in a sense, Russia, it seems, trying to deter other countries from getting involved. Mm-hmm. But here that sort of deterrence might have actually enabled a conflict instead of bringing peace. So it's hard to know. So I think, it's a very complicated subject. But another aspect of that question of, do nuclear weapons deter a conventional war is this question of Ukraine seeming to give up its nuclear weapons for security guarantees.
Yes, right.
And so I want to raise that question of what you think, you both think of that, and actually bring in a question that was submitted in advance by Alex Reed, an applied physics graduate student, who asked, in Ukraine, how prevalent is the sentiment that their post-Cold War denuclearization was a mistake, to the extent that we know? And also, what might be a realistic timeline for renuclearization of Ukraine's weapons programs if we go that route? So, Professor Debs, maybe you could start by commenting on that.
Yeah, well, let me say first, so when we talked about sharing, the plans that the Americans were thinking of in the early 60s was a multilateral force, which would have had joint custody and control over these nuclear weapons, which they shelved after hearing of the Soviet concerns over transfer of nuclear weapons. So I don't disagree with what Professor Gronlund was saying, but wanted to add this point. On the threats, let me talk about the Putin threats and the Ukrainian decision. But so, Talia, you mentioned nuclear weapons being used for deterrence. So the way political scientists think about it is they distinguish between deterrence and compellence. So deterrence is a threat to use nuclear weapons to prevent the other state from taking a particular action. And compellence is to use nuclear threats to try to get the other side to offer concessions. And the general idea is that nuclear weapons are the ultimate tools of deterrence, that if your survival is at stake, you can issue a deterrent threat and the other side may believe it because your survival is at stake. But if you try to use a compellence, that will be hard for you to pull off because the other side will wonder, are you really willing to risk a nuclear war over these concessions that have not been offered in the past or have not materialized? So, for example, if we look at historical crises, during the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev says the West needs to liquidate its right to West Berlin, otherwise unpredictable consequences would happen. That is a compelling threat that he had to back down from because it just wasn't credible. And the Americans said there's no way they're going to fight a nuclear war over this piece of territory. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. did use a compelling threat, so it raised its alert level, it launched a quarantine around Cuba to try to get the Soviets to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. So that is a compelling threat because you're trying to get a concession from the other side. It's also returning to the status quo that you believed was in effect before you learned that the missiles were there. So it has a bit of a deterrent nature to it. Now that was effective. The Soviets did pull out the missiles, but that came at a really high risk of disaster. I mean, there were, U.S. planes dropping depth charges to tell the Soviet subs that they knew they were there, and the Soviet commanders didn't know that this is what the Americans would do, even though the Americans told Moscow the message hadn't made it to the Soviet subs. So they thought the war had started, and they came very close to using nuclear weapons. And I think, again, sort of realizing this imminent disaster is what convinced both Kennedy and Khrushchev that they needed to de-escalate the crisis. So in this particular case, what is happening? I think Putin is trying to turn a compelling threat into a deterrent threat. So what he would like are concessions from Ukraine, but he can't say, do these things, otherwise I nuke you. That would not be credible. Instead, what he's turning that into a deterrent threat, which says, if other countries stand in the way, consequences will be as you've never seen. These economic sanctions are declaring war against me. So if the survival of my state is at stake because of this economic sanction, and therefore if you attack me, I will retaliate. And then we're in the fuzziness if, the more recent threat has been to stop the Americans offering the most sensitive weapons because they're adding fuel to the conflict, and that could lead to unpredictable consequences. But again, the Americans have been providing assistance, and they're very careful not to go for, say, a no-fly zone, which would mean a direct confrontation between Americans or NATO planes and Russian planes, because in that case, then you are increasing the risk of escalation. So I would say Putin has used nuclear threats and he's deterred certain things. For example, the NATO imposing a no-fly zone or sending troops on the ground. But that may be the extent of the concessions he would get unless he is willing to risk ever and ever risk by attacking the supply of these military capabilities and running the risk of coming closer and closer to the source in NATO territory. So that's what I would say about the threats. And then in terms of Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, well, it didn't control them when it gave them up. And so it's not the same thing.
Professor Debs, if you can hear
Yes, there were guarantees that we now see are not being... Oh, did you lose me for a minute?
Just for a few seconds.
Okay, so I said Ukraine did not have operational control of the nuclear weapons on its territory. and it received concessions. What I would say the lesson is not so much, again, the lesson is back to saying that nukes are weapons of the weak, and getting them could make a big difference. In that particular case, Ukraine did not control them, but also that as a result, the process of trying to get nuclear weapons is a very dangerous and risky one. So, we can talk about which states would draw which conclusion. I don't know if you would like me to talk about this now, or I should pause and let Professor Gronlund jump in. But so I think the path for Ukraine, I don't know, so I don't know all that much about the scientific infrastructure in Ukraine to know how much time it would take them to restart a program and complete it. I think that would be a long-term process, which again would expose it to all these risks of Russian intervention if they were to go down that path.
That's really helpful also in answering Alex's question. Do you want to add anything?
Well, Ukraine built missiles, and it never built the warheads. It never did have that infrastructure. So that's a whole different, they have no, expertise in that. They have nothing. So that would be, they'd have to, and of course it's not allowed by the NPT treaty, so they would have to withdraw from that. It would be a disaster. They don't want to do that, trust me, they really don't.
That makes a lot of sense, both on the technical end and the political side there. I just want to ask just a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to you. So, we started some of this conversation by talking about moments of heightened tension, and we're in one now, a moment of heightened tension between Russia and NATO, including the U.S. And so I wanted to ask Dr. Gronlund, historically when tensions were high, it seems misinterpretations that could potentially lead to a nuclear war were more likely to occur. So I want to know if you could tell us one or maybe two of the notable historical cases of that and how that might bear on today.
Yes. So there's another class of risk, which is not a deliberate use of nuclear weapons, but one that is done in a way by not accident, but unintentionally, if you know what I mean. So let me give you an example. So when either country launches a nuclear weapon, the other country can see it. The U.S. has satellites that detect all missile launches all around the world because it's very hot, the missile. And so the idea is if Russia launches a missile at the U.S., it's known. There's a little bit of a gap, okay? You don't know it right away. And then the U.S. also has radars around the world. And so the radar then picks it up. And if it's looking really like it's headed at the U.S., things go into action, okay? So it only takes about 25 minutes for this missile to reach the United States. So the clock is ticking. By the time it goes to the military, they've been using the computers to see where it's going. It goes up the chain within the military, and then they say, no, this is serious. We have to go tell the president. We have to ask the president for permission. Only the president can say, yeah, we should launch a nuclear weapon. So they come up with 2 or 3 options. And the president says, well, I could not do it. You just not do it, or I could do this or this. Now, the problem with our missiles in the silos is because they are so vulnerable, the U.S. has planned to launch them the minute or sort of after some data gathering, which of course, if that's a false alarm, the U.S. has really just started something horrible. And these false alarms have happened. And it never got to the president. In one case there was, the Americans were like, oh my God, this looks exactly like what we had been expecting. It looked exactly like that because the training tape was in the computer. Right, there has been a faulty computer chip that led to this problem. On the other side, the Soviets thought there were some U.S. missiles, and there was a glint of the clouds. So those, people make mistakes, and the consequences are horrendous. There were also, during a period of tension, 1983, the U.S. and NATO always do these exercises where, all their forces, including, the pretend use of nuclear weapons. And this one was a really big exercise, and there were, slightly different. And the Soviets thought this was preparation. They were like, kind of covering up, look over here, when in fact they really intended to target the U.S. And that, led to panic, of course. And so these are the kinds of things that happen, have happened, could happen. And so right now in Ukraine, Russia has issued this kind of vague threat, which I interpret to be, we'll use a small nuclear weapon, and that's the beginning. The U.S. has this theory, so then we'll use it when it's slightly bigger, and finally it'll stop. It'll never go big. It'll stop, and somehow they believe, Russia will stop. So U.S. policy is really ripe for a serious disaster, and this notion, for example, that if there's an incoming Russia, if the U.S. believes there's an incoming Russian attack, and it decides, we don't have time, we need to launch them now, it has been a problem. They will not forgo that option, and it's absurd. When they were deployed back in the day, it's because they were more accurate than the sub-missiles, and that is not true anymore. Whatever benefits you think they might have are actually better with the subs, okay? But does the Air Force want to give these up? No, it does not. That's what it's about, really.
That is really interesting, both the history of how we have ICBMs and how they play into this question of what can go wrong in moments of misinterpretation when people are trying to act very fast because the use it or lose it mentality.
Right.
So we do have to wrap up the panel portion of the discussion, although there's so much more to ask these speakers about. So I look forward to hearing your questions. In particular, it would be great to hear more from Professor Debs if anyone has a question about this related to impacts on proliferation of this war or other evolving proliferation challenges. So I just want to say, ask one last question before we wrap up to both of you, a quick one, which is, what one or two books or articles would you recommend that this audience read on this topic? So first to you, Dr. Gronlund.
Okay, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. So it is written by Fred Kaplan, who has a PhD in political science from MIT, and turned into a reporter, and his book is called The Bomb, which looks at mainly U.S. history from the beginning until very recently. I wanted to share with you, maybe not. Okay, I'm not going to share with you. But I actually wanted to say, the notion that crises can lead to positive things. I believe at this point that the only way that the world, the U.S. and Russia, will really give up on nuclear weapons if something really awful happens, not if there is the possibility. Now, isn't that cheery? Okay, I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much. What about you, Professor Debs?
Well, I'll try to end on a possibly cheerier note. But before I do, two books I'd recommend. When we prepared for this with Talia, I smiled a little bit because I did write a book on this topic. But I guess I would say take my course instead of buying my book. But of course, if you want to know about proliferation, that would be one resource. But let me mention two. So one is by Friedman and Michaels, called The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy. Oops, you won't see it with the background. Maybe I need to take the background off so that we're not confused there.
We got it for a moment.
Yes. So here, so the Friedman and Michaels, The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy, and this is in its 4th edition, and it really is a very comprehensive history of nuclear strategy from all different angles. So this isn't necessarily sort of drinking the deterrence Kool-Aid, but it's looking at it from different perspectives. Another is this, nuclear weapons and coercive diplomacy. So how do states use nuclear weapons in crises? Can you use nuclear threats for compellence? And it's a multi-method book that uses both case studies, so you can learn a lot about history, but also quantitative and statistical tests. So I recommend both. Again, I said you can divide it into the effect and the cause. On the cause, if you would like, you could take a look at my book. We cover the history of a large number of countries that thought about nuclear weapons. So I think you would get a lot on that dimension. But the final optimistic, hopefully, note I would add is Professor Gronlund talked about Able Archer 83, and just to complete the story there, Reagan comes into office and is very aggressive towards the Soviet Union and describes them as the evil empire, and you think, what is the odds that you can have negotiations, agreements, arms control between these two countries? But he's debriefed on Able Archer 83, and he's told that the Soviets really worried about the possibility that the US were about to start a nuclear war. And again, so he comes to it and says, how could that be? I only have, peaceful intentions. And you think, well, after the public speeches you've given, I think there's reasonable inference that you may not have. And that is one of the reasons that spurs him into action to have discussions with Gorbachev at Reykjavik and to agree to the INF Treaty of '87, which unfortunately we don't have now anymore. So I don't know if this has hopeful conclusion, but it did lead to the US and the Soviets agreeing to ban a whole class of weapons between 500 and 5,000 kilometers in range. And so I think there is source for optimism.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's definitely two sides of the coin here.
Yes.
And both true in their own way.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, but if you all have questions for the speakers that don't get addressed in that time, you can come up to Dr. Gronlund after the event, or I assume reach out to Professor Debs by email. Is that okay, Professor Debs?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. So please, if you have questions, raise your hand. Yes, over there. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about how the advent of cyber warfare affects nuclear politics. I know there was Stuxnet a couple years ago with Iran, but that was between Iran and a major power, and what about two major powers in cyber warfare?
Thank you. Do you want to take that?
There is apparently concern a lot within the military, and a lot of the cyber stuff is classified, so I can't really say. I do know somebody who has access to everything, and he says, I'm not worried about nuclear weapons anymore. I'm worried about cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure, electricity infrastructure. So take that, but it certainly makes it easier for somebody to simulate a nuclear attack, right? All you need to do is get the computer to say, you're under attack. And I'm pretty sure that whatever the U.S. has come up with to prevent that is probably at best, certainly untested, and so it's an important consideration. I don't know where it ranks on the concerns, but
that's really interesting, and I mean about the possibility of faking an attack. I don't know what level of capabilities are necessary, but one thing people worry about is nuclear terrorism, which could
yes,
one approach to that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Professor Debs, do you want to add anything, or should I take another question?
Well, what I would add is, the argument of deterrence in nuclear peace is that you could have stability if there are reliable second strikes. And so the cyber attacks that you would have to worry about, one reason you would worry about cyber attacks is it could reduce the confidence from the leadership that they can control their nuclear arsenals, and they could retaliate if they're the target of a first strike. And so that's any technology, and I guess, we could say more about ballistic missile defense technology and whatnot, but anything that suggests that maybe you're after a first strike or the other side worries that they may not have a reliable second strike is really destabilizing.
Yeah. Right. So the U.S., which counts on its submarines to, be the bottom line, if there's some way in which there was an attack on the communication system or, anything on this, right. If that's even a possibility, the Navy and the U.S. would be very unhappy,
That makes
to
sense.
say the least.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Other questions? I'll take from a different table now. Right up there. Yes. Thank you.
Ask a woman.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us. My name is Pranav, and this is to Professor Gronlund. So you mentioned U.S. missile defense systems. One issue that we've seen is that they haven't been shown to be very reliably effective in many cases, right?
Right.
But
So which ones are you talking about?
Ground-based mid-course interceptor, for example, right? That's an example.
Yeah.
I guess one thing we've actually talked about in Professor Debs' class actually is how U.S. work on some of these missile defense systems has caused a bit of a security dilemma, right? With Russia and China developing their
Yes.
hypersonic missiles in response.
Yes.
So would you, I guess, recommend that we do actually work on improving the effectiveness of these systems for security, or would you say that those kind of long-term consequences mean that we should just leave it as it is?
So it has long been recognized that building of even maybe not so capable missile defenses will result in the other country compensating, either by building more and overwhelming it, or by doing other things. All these things that Putin is saying that Russia has done are all about defeating the missile defense system, which, the U.S. stopped building them. Essentially, there are a handful in Alaska, and, it is a program that is hard to kill. Because, how could you say no? Oh, you're not going to defend the United States? And so it goes on, and there are industries that rely on it. So there was a treaty banning missile defenses, except 2 local areas that the U.S. and Soviets signed after scientists from both countries hammered on their leaders. That doesn't seem very intuitive. And so the U.S., started building a missile defense system that it thought was, worth, and they left the treaty. And lo and behold, now we have a missile defense system that won't work in Alaska. And it has been tested against, we call it strap-down chicken tests. So they are told exactly where the missile will be and so forth, and they're not able to deal with countermeasures. So, get rid of it. Get rid of it. And that will make China and Russia a little less anxious. The short-range missile defenses, don't have that concern. Although it's complicated, but...
It's very interesting that something that has defense right there in the name could lead to escalation in terms of arms buildups. I think that's an important point to recognize.
Right.
Do you want to add to that, Professor Debs?
No.
Okay.
I guess what I would say, it does, because again, this nuclear peace and deterrence is based on the ability to retaliate if you ever get to that point. And so if you build a defense, you eliminate the possibility of the other side to retaliate, which then they fear you would use as a cover to be even more aggressive. And so that's sort of the backward logic that lead to this conclusion.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Over there in the white and black shirt. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name's Margaret. I have a question for Professor Debs in response to, so you said that nuclear weapons are a weapon of the weak because they let you attack an enemy without first overwhelming their army or navy in the field. And to me, it seems like that's more property of long-range missiles and bombers, not the warheads. So I like the fact that you can attack your enemy without having to first overwhelm them in the field. So I don't understand the connection between the fact that they're nuclear with strategic bombing.
Yeah, so nuclear weapons enter the scene in 1945 with the Trinity test, and then they're detonated on Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1957, the Soviets are successful in launching Sputnik into space, which then opens up the possibility of ICBMs. And so I guess in the long arc of history, you do see the two arriving somewhat at the same time, where I guess ICBM capabilities happening a little bit later. I guess when international relations scholars think about it, they think about the scale and speed of destruction. And so yes, ICBMs without nuclear warheads could lead to some casualties, but with nuclear weapons, you reach a possibility that your scale of destruction is that much greater. And so I think this is what policymakers worry about. I mean, if you look at the Gulf War I episode, and Iraq is thinking of launching Scud missiles against Israel. So they're not nuclear, and maybe you can launch some missiles that lead to some casualties. But once you get to the nuclear stage, that's just a scale of destruction that's so much more deterring. I do agree with you that they ended up being linked historically, but I think the scale is the trump factor there.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks to you all for those really great questions. And yes, if you have more afterwards, please feel free to come up to or reach out to the speakers. Really wonderful questions. And actually, I want to say we're talking about the strategy here of deterrence and compellence, but there's also, of course, a moral aspect in terms of whether countries should acquire and use nuclear weapons in different contexts, which I think will connect with one of the discussion questions that we'll get to in just a moment. But first, I want to just thank both of our speakers so much for their really insightful comments and answers to your questions. So let's thank them both.
Thank you. And thank you for all coming. The questions have been really great.
Yes.
And none of you
Thank
left.
you for coming.
Oh.
I know everyone might be able to stay till the end, but we actually also even have this room a little past in case people want to continue on with their discussions after. So we're going to ask you now to introduce yourself to those at your tables and discuss one of two questions. So Ellie and Lucas are handing out the papers for the discussions, and we'll also put them up on the screen in just a moment. So pick a question as a group to discuss, and if you kind of get through that one, you're welcome to look to the other one. These discussions are totally informal. Just come from where you're at on these issues. And once the program ends, if you'd like to continue the conversation with those at your table, we encourage you to exchange contact information, because part of what we want to do here is connect people from different disciplines who are interested in issues on science and global affairs and security. So thank you so much, and please begin your discussions, and we'll put the questions up on the screen.
Can I just ask for a show of hands of those of you who are physics science? And then those of you who are political science, economy.
Okay.
All right.
So we have both.
Data.
Yeah, we have both. What I found from these events and posted some different places is it interestingly switches a lot from event to event in terms of where the balance lies. But we always get a nice mix. So, and of course, there are different disciplines within science here represented too, I think, which might shape the discussions. So wonderful. Thank you. All right. Please begin your discussions.